The thing about achieving faster-than-light travel, the various species of the galaxy had learned, was that it opened up a universe of inconveniences previously unimaginable. Sure, you could now visit neighboring star systems in weeks instead of millennia, but you could also stumble into problems that had been safely isolated by the tyranny of distance for billions of years. Problems like, say, ancient crystalline entities that had been napping in asteroid belts since before most species had figured out fire. The Hanari Collective had been the first to catalog these beings, roughly 4,000 years prior. They'd done so from a very safe distance, with very expensive scanning equipment, and had promptly added the relevant star systems to a database labeled places we should probably never go. The Hanari were excellent at identifying problems. They were less excellent at preventing other species from wandering into those problems, like tourists ignoring warning signs at a volcano. The entities themselves were difficult to describe in terms that didn't sound either mystical or absurd. They were massive. For starters, some measuring over a kilometer in their longest dimensions. They were composed of a crystalline lattice that shouldn't exist according to most species' understanding of chemistry, shot through with veins of something that read as both matter and energy depending on how you looked at it. They consumed radiation, processed it through mechanisms that made theoretical physicists weep, and emitted waste products that occasionally bent space-time in localized areas. They reproduced, if that was the right word, once every few million years. They were, in the most technical sense, alive. The smaller species called them gods. The academic species called them ambulatory geological phenomena with unusual energy signatures. Humans, upon hearing about them for the first time, had apparently nodded and said, "Oh," like space whales, which had caused several xenobiologists to require medical attention. For approximately 4 millennia, these entities had minded their own business. They drifted through their asteroid belts, absorbing cosmic radiation, occasionally humming at frequencies that caused nearby electronics to spontaneously reboot, and otherwise bothering absolutely no one. The galaxy had achieved a peaceful equilibrium. The entities stayed in their asteroid fields, and everyone else stayed out of those asteroid fields. Simple, elegant, sustainable. Then humanity showed up and immediately began looking for things to mine. To be fair to the humans, and one had to be fair occasionally even when it caused headaches, they hadn't known about the entities. Earth had only joined the broader galactic community 80 years prior, and the information exchange was still ongoing. There were approximately 9 million star systems on the Don't Go Here list, and the Hanari database administrators had been working through them alphabetically. The Asteroid Gods lived in systems starting with letters the humans hadn't gotten to yet. The mining corporation had set up operations in the Yana Belt, with all the appropriate licenses and none of the appropriate research. They'd sent in automated drones, established a processing station, and had been happily extracting valuable metals for 3 months, before they noticed that their equipment kept experiencing unusual malfunctions. Drones disappeared. Processing stations reported impossible energy reading. One mining vessel had its entire computer system replaced with what appeared to be crystalline growths that somehow still functioned as a computer, but better. Then someone had decided to investigate one of the larger asteroids with a crew, and that crew had discovered they'd been drilling into what was essentially a sleeping god. The entity had not appreciated being used as a mineral deposit. The distress call that went out had been impressively panicked, which was notable because the corporation's communications officer was a Gren, and Grens were physically incapable of panic due to their unusual nervous system. The fact that the message had still somehow conveyed desperate terror through layers of chemical translation spoke volumes about the situation. The Hanari Collective had responded with their typical efficiency, which was to say they'd sent a strongly worded message, recommending immediate evacuation and a promise to add this incident to their database of incidents that proved other species shouldn't be allowed near dangerous things. The Vrin Empire had offered to mediate, which meant showing up with a fleet and hoping the problem would solve itself through intimidation. The Crystalline Concordat had suggested prayer. The mining corporation had done what humans typically did when faced with an existential threat that was also technically a legal liability. They'd looked for the cheapest possible solution that wouldn't result in them getting sued into oblivion. Enter the woman. She'd been working salvage operations in the outer territories for 12 years, and she'd developed a reputation. Not a good reputation necessarily, but a useful one. She took jobs that other salvage operators wouldn't touch. Derelict ships in decaying orbits around black hole. Cargo retrieval from inside active nebulae. That one time she'd recovered a diplomatic vessel from inside a space-time anomaly, and had somehow gotten it out more intact than it had gone in, which several physicists insisted was technically impossible. She'd been hauling scrap metal from a decommissioned station when the offer came through. The corporation representative had been admirably direct. They had a situation involving several dozen extremely powerful entities that had been disturbed during mining operations. The entities were currently destroying equipment, threatening personnel, and generally behaving like any reasonable being would when woken up by someone drilling into their home. They needed someone to resolve the situation. The woman had listened to the entire pitch while eating a sandwich. When the representative finished, she'd taken another bite, chewed thoughtfully, and asked how much they were paying. The number they'd offered had been substantial. The kind of substantial that suggested they were either desperate or had budget approval from someone who was desperate. She'd countered with a number 3 times higher, and they'd agreed within 30 seconds. That should have been her first warning sign. She'd arrived at the Yana Belt 2 weeks later in a ship that looked like it had been assembled from parts salvaged from 6 different vessels. Because it had been. The mining station was a disaster. Half the docking ports had been fused shut by some kind of crystalline growth. The station's main computer was reporting that local spacetime was somewhat negotiable. 3 of the automated defense satellites were orbiting backward. The station administrator had met her at the functional docking port. He'd been a human, which was unusual for corporate positions this far out, and he'd looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Thank God you're here," he'd said, which she'd found ironic given what she was here to deal with. "Explain the situation," she'd said, shouldering her equipment bag. He'd pulled up a holographic display showing the asteroid belt. Approximately 40 entities were highlighted in red, scattered throughout the field. Most were dormant, but 7 were actively moving, and their trajectories brought them past the mining station with uncomfortable regularity. "They're territorial," the administrator explained. "We didn't know they were here. We thought we were drilling into normal asteroids. By the time we realized what we'd disturbed, we'd already damaged 3 of them. And now they're angry. We prefer the term spiritually distressed." She'd stared at him until he looked away. "Fine. They're angry. They've destroyed 8 drones, 4 mining vessels, and they did something to Johnson that turned him religious. He won't stop talking about the beauty of the cosmos and crystalline perfection. Medical can't figure out what's wrong with him." She'd looked at the display again, calculating distances and trajectories. Anyone tried talking to them? The Vryn sent a diplomatic team. The entities responded by broadcasting a message that translated roughly to leave or become part of the asteroid field. The diplomats left. Smart diplomats. "So can you do it? Can you make them leave?" She'd smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that suggested she'd already figured out something that everyone else had missed. "I'm not going to make them leave," she'd said. "I'm going to hunt them." The administrator had laughed nervously. Then he'd realized she wasn't joking. Then he'd asked if she needed anything from the station. "Mining explosives," she'd said. "A lot of them, and something to drink. This is going to take a while." The galactic community had developed, over thousands of years of civilization, a fairly comprehensive set of protocols for dealing with ancient powerful entities. These protocols generally involved some combination of respectful observation, careful negotiation, religious veneration, or simply leaving them alone and pretending they didn't exist. What the protocols absolutely did not include was strapping mining explosives to a salvage shuttle and flying directly at them while playing loud music. The woman had never been particularly good at following protocol. Her ship, a battered vessel, that she'd named something unprintable in 3 languages, had been modified extensively over the years. The engines were overpowered for the frame, giving it acceleration that made passengers nauseous and physics professors uncomfortable. The hull had been reinforced with plating salvaged from a military destroyer, which was technically illegal, but difficult to prove. The cargo bay had been converted into a workshop that contained equipment ranging from standard repair tools to devices that didn't have names because they'd been improvised during emergency. She'd spent the first day studying the entities from a distance, watching their movement patterns through the asteroid field. They moved slowly, deliberately, following paths that seemed random, until you watched long enough to notice the pattern. They were cycling through the belt, each entity following a route that brought it past certain asteroids at regular intervals. Feeding routes, she'd guessed. They absorbed radiation from the asteroids, processed it through whatever impossible biology they possessed, and moved. The damaged ones moved differently, faster, more erratic. They deviated from their routes to pass near the mining station, broadcasting signals that made electronic equipment malfunction and caused humans to experience what the medical team described as cosmic existential dread. She'd selected the smallest of the angry ones for her first attempt. It was only about 200 meters long, which made it practically tiny by entity standards, though still considerably larger than her ship. It was currently drifting past a cluster of iron-rich asteroids, its crystalline structure pulsing with absorbed energy. The approach required precision. She'd killed her ship's engines and used maneuvering thrusters to drift closer, matching the entity's trajectory. From 50 meters away, she could see the damage that the mining drones had caused. A section of its crystalline lattice had been fractured, exposing internal structures that glowed with something that wasn't quite light. The wound, if that's what it was, pulsed irregularly. She'd activated the communication system and broadcast on the frequency that the Vrin diplomats had used. "You having a bad day?" The entity had responded by sending a pulse of energy that fried 3 of her secondary systems and caused the ship's computer to briefly display error messages in a language that hadn't been invented yet. "I'll take that as a yes," she'd muttered, manually rerouting power around the damaged systems. "Look, I understand you're upset. Someone drilled into you. That's got to hurt. But here's the thing. You're in a shipping lane now. Well, a mining lane. Same difference. And that means we've got a problem." Another energy pulse. This one was stronger, and her ship's shields flickered. "So here's what's going to happen," she'd continued, guiding her ship closer. "You're going to stop attacking the mining station. You're going to move to a different asteroid belt, and everyone's going to pretend this never happened. Sound good?" The entity had responded by accelerating directly toward her ship. She'd fired the engines and rolled the ship hard to port, the entity passing close enough that her proximity alarms achieved frequencies normally reserved for soprano singers. She'd curved her trajectory around a nearby asteroid, using its gravity to slingshot back toward the entity from a different angle. "Guess we're doing this the hard way," she'd said, and armed the mining charges. The thing about mining explosives was that they were designed to fracture asteroids in specific ways, creating clean breaks along geological stress points. They weren't designed for use against living crystalline entities that existed partially outside normal spacetime. But the woman had learned, over years of salvage work, that most tools could be repurposed if you were creative enough and didn't care about warranty violations. She'd launched the first charge from her cargo bay, using a pneumatic system designed for deploying repair drones. The explosive package had its own small thruster, guiding it toward the entity's damaged section. The entity had noticed it, had begun to turn, but it moved with the ponderous grace of something that had never needed to dodge before. The charge had struck the fractured section and detonated. The explosion in space was silent, which somehow made it more dramatic. The mining charge had released its energy precisely, fracturing the damaged crystalline structure along existing stress lines. A chunk of the entity, roughly the size of a small car, had broken away and tumbled into the asteroid field. The entity's response had been immediate and dramatic. It had broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, a signal so powerful that it reached the mining station, 3 Vrin observation vessels, and 1 very surprised cargo hauler that had been passing through a system 2 light-years away. The message didn't translate cleanly into any known language, but the sentiment was universal, profound indignation that something so small had just caused it pain. Back at the mining station, the administrator had been monitoring the situation with increasing alarm. "What is she doing?" he'd asked the operations officer. "According to our sensors, she just blew up part of a god." "That's not possible. The Hanari database says they're nearly indestructible. Should someone tell the god that?" The woman had already launched her second charge, this one aimed at a different section of the entity's structure. The entity had tried to evade, moving faster than something that size had any right to move, but she'd anticipated the direction and adjusted her target. The second explosion had removed another chunk. The entity had done something then that surprised her. It had stopped. It had simply halted its movement relative to the asteroid field and hung there, its crystalline structure pulsing with what she could only interpret as confusion. Here was a being that had existed for millions of years, that had survived cosmic radiation, asteroid impacts, and the occasional supernova shockwave, and something tiny had just heard it, twice. She'd opened communications again. Still want to keep attacking the mining station. The entity's response had been different this time, still broadcast on multiple frequencies, but quieter, less rage, more calculation. It had begun moving again, but not toward her ship or the station. It had turned and started drifting away deeper into the asteroid field. That's what I thought, she'd said, and turned her ship to follow it. The administrator's voice had crackled over the communication channel. What are you doing? It's leaving. It's retreating to warn the others, she'd explained, guiding her ship between asteroids. If I let it go, you'll have 40 angry entities instead of 7. Better to finish this now. Finish? You mean kill it? I prefer aggressive relocation, but sure. The chase through the asteroid field had required piloting skills that most sane people wouldn't attempt. The entity had moved through the dense field like it belonged there, because it did. It had been born in this environment, had spent millions of years navigating these rocks, but the woman had spent 12 years flying salvage operations in conditions that ranged from difficult to suicidal, and she'd learned to read gravitational fields like other people read books. She'd caught up to the entity near a cluster of metallic asteroids, their iron content creating localized magnetic anomalies. She'd launched 3 charges simultaneously, spreading them to cover the entity's possible evasion routes. The entity had tried to dodge, but physics only bent so far. 2 charges had missed, tumbling past into the asteroid field. The third had struck center mass. The explosion had been larger this time. A chain reaction through the entity's crystalline structure, fractures spreading like lightning through ice. The entity had broadcast one final message, a sound like distant crystals breaking, and then it had simply fallen apart. Pieces tumbled through the asteroid field, their internal glow fading as the coherent structure that had held them together dissolved. The woman had sat in her pilot's chair, watching the debris scatter, and taken a drink from the flask she kept in the cockpit. 1 down, she'd said to no one in particular. 39 to go. Back at the mining station, the operations staff had stood in stunned silence, staring at their sensor displays. Did she just? One of them started. Yes, the administrator confirmed. But they're supposed to be immortal. Someone should probably update the database. Within 6 hours, word had spread through the local communication networks. The Vrin observation fleet had reported the incident to their command. The Hynari Collective had received the data with alarm and immediately begun revising their threat assessment. 3 separate religious organizations had declared the event either a miracle or a heresy, depending on their theological framework. And somewhere in the asteroid field, 6 more entities detected the fragments of their destroyed companion, and realized that something new had entered their environment, something small, fast, and apparently insane. The hunt had begun. The second entity had been smarter than the first, which created the uncomfortable implication that these ancient crystalline beings could learn and adapt. This was precisely the kind of detail that the woman would have appreciated knowing before she'd started hunting them. But the Hynari database had apparently classified that information under probably not important enough to mention. The entity had been waiting for her near a cluster of nickel-iron asteroids, positioned where the magnetic fields created sensor dead zones. It had learned from the first one's destruction, had watched through whatever senses these beings possessed, and had decided that ambush was preferable to direct confrontation. This suggested either intelligence or very sophisticated instinct, and the woman wasn't sure which option was more concerning. She detected it only because one of her secondary sensor arrays had picked up an anomalous gravity reading 3 seconds before the entity had accelerated out of the asteroid cluster directly toward her ship. 3 seconds was barely enough time to fire the engines and roll, the entity's bulk passing close enough that its energy field had caused her ship's hull to resonate at frequencies that made her teeth hurt. Clever, she'd acknowledged, bringing her ship around. The entity had already disappeared back into the magnetic interference, playing hide-and-seek with a being that weighed several thousand tons and could bend space-time was not how she'd planned to spend her afternoon. But flexibility had always been important in salvage work. She'd launched a dozen sensor drones into the asteroid cluster, small devices that spread throughout the field and created a detection network. The entity had destroyed 3 of them immediately with focused energy pulses, but the remaining 9 had given her enough data to track its position. It was moving through the asteroids in a spiral pattern, using the magnetic fields to mask its approach. The woman had armed 4 mining charges and deployed them at cardinal points around the cluster, each charge attached to a small maneuvering thruster. Then she'd flown her ship directly into the center of the field, engines running hot, broadcasting her position like an invitation. The entity had taken the bait. It had accelerated from below, rising through the asteroid field with surprising speed. She'd fired her engines at maximum thrust, pulling up and away, the entity following. When it had cleared the asteroid cluster and committed to the pursuit, she'd triggered all 4 charges simultaneously. The explosives had detonated in a carefully timed sequence, the shockwaves channeling through the asteroid field and converging on the entity's position. The effect had been less direct damage and more catastrophic disruption. The entity's crystalline structure had shattered along multiple fracture lines simultaneously, and the being had simply disintegrated into thousands of tumbling fragments. The Vrin observation fleet, watching from a safe distance, had transmitted a brief message consisting of what their translators rendered as 3 question marks and a symbol indicating profound confusion. The 3rd and 4th entities had tried working together, which suggested these beings had some form of communication that nobody had previously detected. They'd coordinated their attack, approaching from opposite vectors, while the woman had been investigating a debris field from the 2nd entity. She'd escaped by diving into a dense asteroid cluster and using the gravitational chaos to break their tracking. Then she doubled back and picked them off individually, using tactics that became more creative with each engagement. The 4th entity had met its end when she'd lured it into a decaying orbit around a small moon, then used the moon's gravity well to slingshot a cargo container full of mining charges directly into its path at a relative velocity that made the resulting collision briefly create a light show visible from the mining station. By the end of the 2nd day, 5 entities had been reduced to fragments. The mining station staff had stopped being horrified and had progressed to morbid fascination. Someone had started a betting pool on how long each hunt would take. The operations officer had begun maintaining a log that he'd titled Incident Report, Decide. The Galactic communication networks had caught fire with the news. The Inari Collective had issued 4 separate statements, each more alarmed than the last. The crystalline Concordat had declared a period of mourning. The Vrin Empire had dispatched additional observation vessels because their analysts refused to believe the reports without direct confirmation. One entrepreneurial grin had started selling holographic recordings of the hunts, which was probably illegal but definitely profitable. Religious organizations across 12 systems had begun theological debates about what it meant that beings they'd considered divine could be killed by someone flying a salvage ship and using commercial explosives. Several priesthoods had experienced schism. One particularly pragmatic sect had simply updated their doctrine to classify the woman as a higher-tier deity and moved on. The woman, for her part, had been too busy hunting to pay attention to any of this. The 6th entity had been the largest one she'd faced yet, nearly 400 meters long and so old that its crystalline structure contained isotopes that hadn't existed naturally in the universe for several billion years. It had also been significantly more aggressive than the others, actively seeking her out rather than waiting to be found. The hunt had ranged across half the asteroid belt. The entity had demonstrated abilities that the previous ones hadn't shown, creating localized gravitational distortions that pulled asteroids into her flight path, broadcasting signals that temporarily disabled her navigation systems, and on one memorable occasion causing the space around her ship to briefly experience time at different rates, which had resulted in some very confusing sensor readings and a headache that had lasted for hours. She'd eventually trapped it in a section of the belt where 3 large asteroids created a natural bottleneck. She'd seeded the area with charges over the course of 6 hours, placing them carefully while the entity had stalked her through the rocks. When it had finally committed to an attack run, she'd triggered the entire network at once. The explosion had been visible from the mining station. 16 mining charges detonating in a choreographed sequence, each blast timed to channel energy through the crystalline structure's weak points. The entity had tried to escape, had almost made it, but the final 3 charges had caught it at the edge of the explosion radius. Its structure had fractured catastrophically, and what remained had tumbled into a nearby asteroid, the impact finishing what the explosives had started. The woman had returned to the mining station to resupply and the administrator had met her at the docking port with the expression of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally altered over the course of 48 hours. 6, he'd said. You've destroyed 6 of 7 if you count the one that's only half dead, she'd corrected, shouldering her equipment bag. It's hiding in Sector 18, probably dead by tomorrow. The Hynari want to speak with you, so do the Vrin. And something called the crystalline concordate sent a message that our translator couldn't process without crashing. Tell them I'm busy hunting gods. Busy hunting angry rocks that won't leave your station alone, she'd correct. Though I admit the pay is good enough that I'm not picky about terminology. She'd slept for 6 hours, eaten something that the station cafeteria claimed was food, and launched again. The remaining entities had changed their behavior pattern. They'd stopped drifting along their usual routes, and had clustered together in the densest part of the asteroid belt, forming a defensive formation that suggested either intelligence or instincts. Sophisticated enough to be indistinguishable from intelligent. The woman had studied their formation from a distance, calculating approaches and discarding them. A direct assault would be suicide, the entities had learned. They'd adapted. They were no longer ancient beings existing in peaceful equilibrium with their environment. They were cornered, dangerous, and apparently capable of strategic thinking. She'd smiled then because this was the kind of problem she enjoyed solving. The kind that required creativity, improvisation, and a willingness to attempt things that safety regulations explicitly forbade. She'd spent the next 12 hours preparing. The largest entity in the Yana belt was old enough to remember when the local star had been younger and brighter, when the asteroid field had been a planet before some ancient catastrophe had shattered it into millions of tumbling rock. It had witnessed the birth and death of smaller entities, had absorbed the radiation from passing cosmic events, and had existed in a state that most biological beings would describe as contemplative meditation for several million years. It had never in all that time experienced anything remotely resembling its current situation. The remaining entities had gathered around it in the densest section of the belt, where asteroids clustered so tightly that navigation was nearly impossible for vessels with conventional engines. They'd positioned themselves in a formation that would make any military strategist nod in approval, overlapping their energy fields to create a defensive perimeter that could detect and disable approaching threats. They'd learned quickly, these ancient beings. Fear was an excellent teacher. The woman had spent those 12 hours preparing something that would either be remembered as brilliant or catastrophic, with very little middle ground between those outcomes. She'd emptied the mining station's entire supply of explosives, which had caused the administrator to require sedation, and the accounting department to experience collective panic. She'd requisitioned every automated mining drone in the facility, reprogrammed their navigation systems, and loaded each one with enough charges to fracture a small moon. Then she'd done something that made the Vrin observers question whether humans understood the concept of self-preservation. She'd flown directly into the entity formation, not aggressively, not with weapons armed or engines blazing. She'd simply drifted in on minimal power, broadcasting a message on every frequency the entities used. The message was simple, transmitted in mathematical patterns that transcended language. Negotiation. The entities had hesitated. The largest one had moved forward slowly, its crystalline structure pulsing with what might have been curiosity or might have been the preparation for an attack that would vaporize her ship. At this range she could see the details of its structure, the way energy flowed through impossible lattices, the sections where cosmic radiation had been compressed into forms that shouldn't exist according to standard physics. She'd opened the communication channel. "You're trapped," she'd said, knowing they couldn't understand the words but trusting they'd grasp the concept. "You stay here, you die. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. I've got enough explosives staged around this field to crack every asteroid larger than my ship. Nowhere to hide." The entity had broadcast a response, a complex signal that her computer had translated roughly as defiance mixed with calculation. These beings weren't stupid. They understood threat. They also understood that they'd already lost 6 of their kind to something that shouldn't have been capable of harming them. "But here's the thing," she'd continued, pulling up a navigation chart. "There are 47 asteroid belts within 3 months' travel. Most of them are empty. No mining operations, no territorial disputes, No annoying humans drilling into your relatives. I can get you there. She'd transmitted coordinates, highlighting 3 belts that her research indicated were rich in cosmic radiation and completely uninhabited. The entities could thrive there, could return to their million-year meditations without interruption. The largest entity had considered this for approximately 3 minutes, which was the fastest decision-making anyone had ever recorded from these beings. Then it had broadcast a response that her translator had rendered as cautious acceptance. Excellent, she'd said. Now here's the part you're not going to like. She'd activated the mining drone. 47 automated drones had emerged from hiding positions throughout the asteroid field, each one loaded with explosives and programmed with very specific instruction. They'd taken up positions around every entity in the formation, close enough that their detonation would be catastrophic, but far enough that they weren't an immediate threat. Insurance, she'd explained. You come with me peacefully, I guide you to the new belt, everyone live. You try anything creative during the journey. These drones turn you all into very expensive gravel. Clear? The entity had pulsed with what the sensors interpreted as profound irritation, but it had broadcast agreement, so had the others. The journey to the new asteroid belt had taken 19 days, and had become the most watched event in local space. The Vryn fleet had followed at a respectful distance. News ships from 8 different networks had covered it continuously. The woman had piloted her ship at the front of a procession of ancient crystalline entities, each one surrounded by armed drones, moving through space like the universe's strangest parade. When they'd reached the designated belt, she'd deactivated the drones and watched as the entities dispersed into their new home. The largest one had remained behind for a moment, broadcasting a final message. Her translator had struggled with it, finally rendering it as something between gratitude and a promise that if they ever met again under different circumstances, the outcome might be very different. Looking forward to it, she'd said, and turned her ship toward home. The aftermath had been predictably absurd. The mining corporation had paid her fee plus a bonus that suggested they'd been terrified she might change her mind about the peaceful relocation approach. The Hinari Collective had updated their database with 17 new entries about entity behavior, human unpredictability, and the importance of reading safety warning. The Crystalline Concordat had declared her either a prophet or an abomination, then split into 2 separate organizations over the disagreement. 3 governments had tried to hire her for similar problems. 4 universities had offered research positions. 1 military organization had extended a recruitment offer that she'd declined with language colorful enough to cause their translator software to crash. She'd returned to salvage work, taking jobs in the outer territories, where people were sensible enough not to drill into sleeping gods. The legend, though, had taken on a life of its own. Stories spread through the communication networks, each retelling adding new embellishments, until the truth became indistinguishable from mythology. And somewhere in a distant asteroid belt, ancient crystalline entities that had existed since before most species evolved, continued their million-year meditations, occasionally sharing memories of the small annoying thing that had hunted them with mining explosives and an overconfident attitude. The galaxy had learned an important lesson from the incident, though different species interpreted that lesson differently. The Hinari concluded that database maintenance was critically important. The Vryn determined that humans required additional observation. Religious organizations decided that divinity was more complex than previously thought. But the mining corporations learned something much simpler: read the warnings, respect the local wildlife, and if you absolutely must disturb something ancient and powerful, make sure you can afford to hire someone crazy enough to fix the problem afterward. The woman, settling into her pilot's chair for another salvage run, had raised her flask in a private toast to a job completed and a reputation thoroughly cemented. Somewhere in the universe, gods exist, and now they knew that occasionally, very occasionally, something smaller could make them reconsider their position. The legend was complete. The gods had been hunted, relocated, and thoroughly educated about the concept of property right. And the galaxy continued spinning, slightly more aware that ancient and powerful didn't necessarily mean safe from irritated humans with explosives.